All right, so our introduction question is, does the love of Christ show in your life, even towards people you aren't comfortable around? While this does not apply to everyone in this room, I think it's safe to say that the American people as a whole are very intimidated by Arabs ever since 9/11. And so what we want to communicate to you tonight is that your average Muslim neighbor is not going to blow you up. You know, they're not here to commit jihad. And as we'll explain at the end of tonight, when we visited with the Muslims, they were more charitable than some Christians sometimes. So we want you to not be intimidated. We want you to see that this is a good and noble cause to be Jesus to these people, because they need it just as much as we do. So this is week 3. We're going to introduce the religion of Islam tonight. We're glad you're here, especially since there was supposed to be a snowpocalypse round 2 tonight. So one other note I'd like to make before we actually start is I want you to consider your personal calling in this. So if you look at the very bottom, I'm not assuming everyone in this room is so devoted to this that they're ready to move to Saudi Arabia, they're going to die out there, they're going to be a martyr for Christ. I know that is not hardly anybody in this room. So I would venture to guess that everyone's in category 1 or 2. You probably live near the community hall over on Fairway. Or maybe you have one Muslim neighbor who you work with 5 days a week. And so we're not telling you about Islam to show you, okay, you better get ready, move to Saudi Arabia, you know. So that's just something I wanted to get off my chest real quick. So Islam means submission. That's the first blank. So it's very important that we understand what the main goal, what the core values of the entire religion are. And so Islam, it sounds like a scary word, but all it means is you are completely submitting your will to Allah's will. And so, and Muslim is the adjective version, where it's the person submitting, Muslim. So Stephen Prothero uses a 5-point formula. Stephen Prothero wrote the book God Is Not One, where he reviews the 10 major religions of the world. And these 5 points are what he applies to Christianity, just so you can understand how I go forward with it when we get to Islam. So in Christianity, the problem that it sees in the world is sin. That's our problem. Our solution is to get salvation, and our goal is to be to be sinless perfection, to be in heaven with the Lord, and to be Christ to people that we run into. And our technique for doing that is following the greatest commandment. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might, and thy neighbor as thyself. And our exemplar is Jesus Christ. And I put the Apostle Paul here because there's several passages where Paul says, as I follow Christ, follow me. Because there's only so much we can look to for Christ as an example before we think, oh, Christ never drove a car. How do I know how to drive a car like Christ did? You know, that sort of thing. So with these 5 points applied to Christianity, let's see what they look like applied to Islam. That's what's on your notes here. The problem is shirk. Shirk is the idea that, really it's idolatry. That's how we can boil it down. It's this idea of complicating or giving a partner to Allah. That doesn't mean getting Allah a girlfriend. That just means Allah is singular. We'll get into that in a minute. The word for it is tawheed, which means he is perfectly singular. They don't believe in a trinity. They believe God is one, period. And so when we complicate God and say Allah has a son or Allah is a father, that's the worst possible sin you can commit in Islam. So it's shirk. Stephen Prothero actually says that the specific shirk that is the problem in Islam is the shirk of the self. It's self-idolatry. Americans wanting to be independent, wanting to do things how they want, and the idea of Islam is, no, you don't do what you want. You do what Allah wants you to do. And so it makes perfect sense that the solution is Islam, complete submission to Allah. And Surah 49:14 says, the Bedouins say, we believed. That's the neighboring tribe to the Arabs, to the Muslims. And so then the Quran tells the Muslims to say, no, you have not yet believed, but say instead, we have submitted. That's the important thing. So you can say all day, oh, I believe in Allah. That's great. Well, just like in James 2:19, it says, you believe that God is one. That's great. But the demons believe too, and they tremble. So belief is not salvific. It's the trust and it's the submission. That's what matters in Islam and in a completely different way in Christianity as well. The goal is a two-part goal. It's for our good works to outweigh our bad works. And this goes to the idea, it's on the next slide, I'll get to that in a second. And the second part is to enter Jannah, which is heaven. And there we will receive huris. You've probably heard of the huris before. The whole 72 virgins thing, that's not quite in the Quran. We don't actually get the number 72 from the Quran. That comes from the hadith, which are the teachings. It's a separate document. We'll explain that tonight. But huris are basically, it's kind of strange, but this is how the Quran describes it. They are non-human, feminine beings with large breasts, I'm not making this up, large breasts, large eyes, and they're translucent to the bone marrow, which, I don't know, in my opinion, that's kind of scary. But, so we don't actually get the number 72 from the Quran, so you can write a question mark there. I should say the Muslims we met with said it was 2, so maybe you can put a 2 in that blank if you'd like. So that is our two-part goal. And I might as well mention, Jannah is heaven in Islam, but it's different from our heaven. You see, we believe that at the beginning of the Bible, humanity was in perfection in the Garden of Eden, and at the end of the Bible, we are brought into the New Jerusalem, which we call, that sort of thing. With Islam, it's a literal circle. You're going back to the Garden of Eden. In Islam, the Garden of Eden is not on earth, it's in heaven. And so when Adam and Eve sinned, they were cast down to earth, a lot like how we say Satan was cast from heaven. And so our actual goal is to get back to the Garden of Eden up there. So you see, that's a very subtle difference, but it's important. Okay, so this brings us to human nature. I'm going to take a pause on the 5 points real quick. Human nature, they believe, is fitra, which is the idea that all are Muslims at birth. We are all Muslims. Hindus believe a similar thing. We're all Hindus. And so the hadith states, the hadith says that Muhammad said, no one is born except according to intrinsic nature, but their parents make them Jews or Christians or Magians. Just as a cow gives birth to a calf, that is whole. You will never find a cow giving birth to a calf that is mutilated. So the idea is, you're perfect as a Muslim, so you're going to be born perfect. Allah designed you perfectly. And so I talk about human nature here because if you start with the assumption that Muslims believe in sin nature, you've already messed up, because they don't. They believe it is a neutral slate. You're like a blank canvas, and as you walk through life, that's when you get good thrown at you, you get bad thrown at you. It's your decisions that make your nature. So very important distinction we have to make there early on. And they believe that when they will... going back to the previous slide actually. For good works to outweigh bad works is our goal. That comes from the idea on this slide here that when you stand before Allah, there are scales presented before you. All during your life, you've probably seen this in Disney movies actually, all during your life there's 2 angels on your shoulders. On the left shoulder is the angel that records your evil, and on your right shoulder is the angel who records your good. At your death, you stand before Allah in front of these scales, and the angels fly to the scales, put their scrolls on. That's what this picture is. They put their scrolls on the scales, and whichever one weighs most, that's where you go. And the side of the body, the sides of the body are very important. Right is blessing, left is cursing. This is why Jesus went to the right hand of the Father, because it was an Eastern culture. People knew, oh, right hand, blessing. And it's why we salute with our right hand. It's why we shake with the right hand. It even seeped into Western culture somewhat. And so, but even still, just because you're in front of these scales and they weigh a certain way, Allah is not just as Yahweh is. Allah can tip the scales. He can put his finger underneath and say, I'll let you into heaven anyway. And while that sounds great and it sounds like, oh, Allah's really generous, take a moment to consider, that means that he's not just. If he's not perfectly beholden to his principles, he is not just. And that's not what we see with the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible, though he treats different groups of people in different ways, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the concept never changes. It is always, there must be an atonement for sin. There is no finger under the scales tipping it in your favor. There must be an atonement. In the Old Testament, it was the Paschal Lamb. In the New Testament, it is our Lord Jesus Christ. So, back to the 5 points. The technique is to study the Quran and abide in the 5 pillars. The studying the Quran part is the interesting thing, because depending on the Muslim you ask, they might not be reading the Quran. The Quran, as I mentioned last week, actually means the recitation. And so the idea is, I put the solution on there twice. I'm so sorry. Yeah, it's right above exemplar. The technique is found through practicing the 5 pillars. So, but depending on the Muslim you ask, you might be interacting with a Western Muslim who grew up in the United States and was taught, you must defend yourself against Christians, you need to know what the Quran says. That is very different from Eastern culture, where they never read the Quran. They hear what their imam tells them on Friday, and that's all they need to know. It's an authority complex. It's you respect your imam, so you trust what he says. And we'll get into Eastern versus Western culture next week when we get into actually talking to Muslims and actually evangelizing them. So, and Brandon in a moment is going to cover the 5 pillars when he does his portion. So we'll get into that. The exemplar, of course, is the Prophet Muhammad. And I include this picture here because it tells you a lot with just one picture. So the flames behind him, that's basically their equivalent of the halo. And I forgot what this horse thing is called, but
Burak.
Burak, yes. This is the Burak. In a moment, we're going to play a 5-minute video which explains the Burak and all of that. But just know that Muhammad went on a trip, basically on a supernatural pony, and so you notice that his face is whited out. It's not so much whited out; there's a veil in front of it. So you've probably heard of this before, and you actually you'll probably remember the Charlie Hebdo incident in France. Yeah, so that was based around the idea that Charlie Hebdo was making illustrations of Muhammad. And whether they're good or they're bad, of course, Charlie Hebdo was trying to be bad about it, trying to disrespect Muhammad. But even if you're trying to be good about portraying Muhammad in a picture, it is sin. It's idolatry. They are very strict about their idolatry, about not being idolatrous. And so this picture doesn't actually have it, but there's another painting of Muhammad where his sleeves are longer than his hands, so that the painter could say, well, I didn't paint Muhammad, I just painted his clothes. So they're very technical on this. And so any picture you'll see of Muhammad, it'll look something like this, but even these are few and far between. They take this very seriously. So altogether, our 5 points from Prothero. We have the problem of humanity is that we have shirk. Our problem is shirk. We are idolatrous. We complicate the simplicity of God. He's the only simple being. We're all complicated. And shirk of the self is another way you can put it, self-sufficiency. Our solution is to submit completely to Allah's will and give up our own will, so that is Islam. And when we do that, we are Muslim. Our goal is for the good works to outweigh our bad works when our angels put the scroll on the scales. And then we will enter Jannah, we will re-enter the Garden of Eden and receive our huris. The technique is to study the Quran and abide in the 5 pillars. And our exemplar, of course, is the Prophet Muhammad. One thing I forgot to say about the huris. Women probably noticed this immediately. Men were probably not so much. But I want you to consider that Islamic heaven is geared towards a very specific audience. Can you guess who? 7th century caravan robbers who are hungry for fornication. And so, women, I hope that if before you walked in here tonight, if you were intimidated if you were intimidated in approaching a Muslim woman because she's covered in all these, the burqa and all of that, I want you to consider that they're not evil. They're not trying to hurt you. They're not trying to trip you up. These women are crying out for help silently. With the advent of the internet, we were talking about this before class, the internet is going to be a huge bane to Islam, because now Muslim women have the ability to communicate without their face being seen. There's this whole discussion online about Muslim women, like, how we have apologetics and we ask our pastors difficult questions. Well, what will it be like in heaven? And doesn't that seem weird that it's like that? And well, Muslims have a very similar question about heaven. In heaven, the women ask on these apologetic websites, they ask, when I get to heaven, am I going to be jealous of the houris sleeping with my husband? You know, however many there are, 72 or 2, it doesn't matter. But I want you to consider Muslim women are second-class citizens. They're second-class souls to Allah and to Islam as a whole. And so as we talk tonight, I want you to be able to see that this whole idea that Muslims are violent and they're just waiting to slit your throat if you get close enough, and you know all these awful things, that's not every Muslim. Not every Christian is Westboro Baptist Church. Not every Christian is a Mormon. Not every Mormons aren't Christians. But this is the idea that we do not want to generalize Muslims. And so even as Brandon begins his section in a moment, when we talk about what Muslims believe and what Muslims hold to and how Muslims practice, I never want you to assume this is every single Muslim on the face of the planet, because it's not. You might meet a Muslim who never prays. They'd be hard-struck calling themselves a Muslim. There are Muslims who don't like the idea of houris in heaven. There are Muslims who know a bunch about Muhammad and it bothers them. There are Muslims that know nothing about Muhammad and they think he's this amazing person, this perfect person. So that's about all I have. So just keep in mind that we don't want to generalize. So, all right, here you go. There's that. Put that on there.
Okay, so let's jump into the 5 pillars of Islam. This is probably something you've at least heard of. This is central to Islam. This is basically, so if you didn't catch on with what he was saying, Islam is extremely works-based. There's no grace. They call it grace. It's not grace. They say that Allah, or their God, is ever merciful. He's most gracious, all this kind of stuff. But then, in order to make that true, you have to change the definition of what grace is. It's grace through their definition. So for them, you must do all of these 5 things religiously. And that's the only way you can even have a chance to get into heaven. And you could even do all of these religiously, and when you get to heaven, Allah could tip the scales and send you to hell anyways. Or you could do none of it, and yet he'll still tip the scales and let you in anyways. So let's get into it. The first of the, here are all the 5 pillars, and they're on your sheet. You can just fill them in as we go. So the very first one is called the Shahada. This is a declaration of faith. So this is how you become a Muslim. So they believe that everybody is born a Muslim, but yet as you go through life, you either get bad or get good or whatever, and so a lot of people apostatize from their original Islam. And so this is how you become a professing Muslim. You have to recite the Shahada, which is found in the Quran and in the Hadiths. The Hadiths, like he mentioned, are not scripture. So they are the sayings of the Prophet, and they're written by other people, not the Prophet himself, and they're the sayings of him, but they're written by a lot of different people. And Muslims will argue whether they're scripture, whether they're true, whether they're not. And so it really complicates things. I mean, imagine if we had a separate book that was the sayings of Polycarp, of Paul's followers, and then we treated that like doctrine. That would be a disaster. But that's what the Hadiths are, and that's where we get actually most of the information about Islam and about how to be a Muslim and who Muhammad was and all this kind of stuff is mostly found in the Hadiths. So the Shahada is found in the Quran in parts and in the Hadiths in parts, and they put them together, and that's what it is. So it parallels Romans 10:9, where it says that if you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For them, they believe that the Muslim's profession of faith must be said with conviction, and you must recite it word for word, and then you're in. But that doesn't mean that you're in heaven. That just means you're a Muslim. And then, as they described to us at the mosque when we went this last Friday, that is you stepping into the gates of Islam, not the gates of heaven, stepping into the gates of Islam, and now you must follow these 5 pillars. And so this is the very first pillar. The second pillar is called zakat. It's a lot like our tithe, except for them it's obligatory. You absolutely must do it. For us, we believe that a good starting point is 10%, and it's just generosity. We think that you should, but you're not going to get hauled off to jail or excommunicated from the church if you don't tithe. So for them, zakat is obligatory, but it's only 2.5%. For them, it is charity. It's not given to the mosque. It's given to other Muslims that are in need. And it's based on if they are above the poverty line or below the poverty line. So it's a 2.5% charity based on the total amount of money that you've had in your possession for one lunar year, ending in the month of Ramadan. The money is to be given to Muslims under the poverty line. If you are under the poverty line, you don't give zakat, you receive zakat. So it's basically their version of charity, except it's obligatory. And remember, keep in mind, as we go through all these 5 pillars, this is them earning their place in heaven, but yet they could still get denied heaven even if they do all of this perfectly, because Allah can do what he wants. So the next one is the salat. That is the 5 prayers. If you've heard about the Muslims doing their 5 prayers a day, if you see videos of over in the Middle East where they have the minarets, those huge towers, and they do their call to prayer from there, this is one of their 5 pillars. They believe that you must pray 5 times a day. If you're not praying 5 times a day in a specific way, it's a list of do this, don't do this, then Allah will not hear your prayers and he will not think that you're a faithful Muslim. So they have to follow a distinct set of movements that must be very precise, and if you mess up one of them, you have to start over. There are certain things that if you do them wrong, you have to go back and do a cleansing ritual, which we'll get to in a second, and re-cleanse yourself, washing of water and stuff like that. And you have to do that ritual 3 times. Then you can restart the prayer, and if you mess it up, then you start it all over again. It's very, very ritualistic. While we were at the mosque, which we'll go into more in detail later, but while we were in the mosque, we were watching people come in for their Friday service, because they have their church service on Friday. We were watching people come in, and every single one of them did the same exact hand motions and body motions and all this kind of stuff, the same exact amount of time, very ritualistic. A side note is, Muslims are Eastern in thought, meaning from the East, and they're outwardly focused. So everything is, they want everything to be seen. So they think that if they don't see us Christians praying in public, that we just don't pray at all. That's why they are very outward in their prayer, in their mourning, all that kind of stuff is very outward, because they don't believe that it's genuine if it's not expressed outwardly. So here's another picture of the salat. So this is, the picture on the left is actually a sign from the Muslim Community Center here in Wichita Falls that shows the times of day that all the prayers are to be done. The 5 different prayers are set in 5 different times per day. The first is right after the first light of day, before sunrise. So you have to wake up before sunrise. There's no oversleeping in Islam, and conveniently, part of that prayer says you have to recite that prayer is better than sleep in the very first prayer. And it all has to be done in Arabic. It's null and void if it's done in any other language besides Arabic. As a side note, they believe that the Quran was written in Arabic and it has always existed eternally in heaven in Arabic. So they believe that Arabic is the original language of humanity, and it's the only it's the only language that is valid when worshiping Allah. Second is an early afternoon between the time the sun begins its decline and ends when it's halfway to sunset. Can you go check my phone? I think it just stopped recording. Then the third one is between the time the sun is halfway to setting and before it actually begins to set. Then you have another prayer that's between sunset and the disappearance of the light, and then another one after it's dark, after it gets fully dark and before the first light of dawn, but preferably before midnight. By reading this, my immediate thought was, how in the world do they get anything done? Like, they're praying constantly. Like, as soon as one prayer finishes, the next one starts, and that's why you'll see a lot of Muslims that will bring their prayer rugs with them, and so if in their office, they'll just lay it in the corner, get their compass out, point it towards Mecca, and then do their prayers. So that's another thing about their prayers, is that it must be done towards what's called the Kaaba in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia. The black thing is the Kaaba, and they believe that there is a black stone in there that is, it's complicated, but basically they believe it's an eternal being that's sentient, but yet it's not, because then that would be equating something equal with Allah. It's a big mess. But anyways, you pray towards that. That's the only way Allah will actually hear your prayers. If you pray any other direction, Allah won't be able to hear your prayers. They say that it's because of obedience, To me, it sounds like a limitation of Allah. So then the fourth and fifth pillar is Psalm. This is number 4. That's why we put the moon on there, because Psalm is fasting for Ramadan. So if you've heard of the month of Ramadan, it's based on a lunar calendar. You must fast during the day. There's a huge list in this book that they gave us at the mosque, Elementary Teachings of Islam, by actually a well-known Islamic scholar from the 1950s. There's a huge list of things you have to abstain from. In general, don't put anything in your body during the month of Ramadan as long as there is light in the sky. Once the sun sets, then everything goes. And so during the month of Ramadan, it's a whole bunch of fasting and then a whole bunch of feasting and a whole bunch of gorging themselves. They also, just as a side note, you'll notice that a lot of the violence that ends up coming up in the Middle East happens during Ramadan. So this last Gaza war, where they started launching rockets at Israel, was during Ramadan. It's supposed to be a very peaceful time, and it wasn't. Because what even Muslim sources are starting to figure out is that when you have to abstain for an entire month, you have to abstain from taking anything into your body during the day, and then you gorge yourself at night. It ends up causing a lot of health issues, and it also ends up causing a lot of mental issues too. And then the last one is Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca. So Hajj is spelled H-A-J-J. I realized that I didn't put Swam on there, or Psalm. It's S-A-W-M. That's the fasting for Ramadan. The other one's Salat. I thought I put them on here. S-A-L-A-T is Salat. And then, okay, I did put Shahada on there because that's like impossible to spell. Zakat, Z-A-K-A-T. So the Hajj is the pilgrimage to Mecca. They believe that it is your duty as a faithful Muslim that at least once in your life, if you are financially able and your health allows it, you must make a pilgrimage to Mecca. Mecca is their holy city because they believe that is where Muhammad got his revelation. And so you must make a pilgrimage there. They have a very specific type of ritual that you do, rotating around the Kaaba 7 times and all this kind of stuff, which we'll get into that next week about the source of that ritual and where that actually comes from. But anyways, this is the obligatory pilgrimage to Mecca. So you are exempt from it if you are poor and can't afford it, or if you're infirm and you can't physically travel there. Salvation, so in general, to become a Muslim, you must confess the Shahada with conviction. You can't just recite it. That's why I don't care if I recite it, because I don't actually believe it. So it means nothing. You must follow the 5 pillars faithfully. And then on Judgment Day, when you stand before Allah, the angel on your left and your right will give their accounts. And then they'll put them on the scale, and whichever one outweighs, whichever one is heavier, that's where you go. One of the things that the Muslims here in town told us, which I have not been able to find it in the Quran, but I'm sure it's somewhere in there, or the Hadiths, is that one good deed is worth the same weight as 10 bad deeds. So good deeds are more valuable than bad deeds. So just keep that in mind. But I did ask them specifically, is there a guarantee of salvation? If you are the most, I mean, if you're an imam, which is their version of a pastor, if you're an imam and you have kept this from the time you were 4 years old or 7 years old, and you've never messed up, is it possible to go to hell? And they said, yeah, we don't know, because Allah does what he wants. And he's all powerful. Basically, because they wanted to make a God that was all powerful, they had to put themselves in this corner where, oh yeah, you can do his entire commandments and there's no guarantee you're going to get into heaven, but at the same time, somebody else can be in rebellion against him their entire life and do one good deed and get into heaven. So here's a video about the historical, this is called the classical account. This is where Islam came from. This is what you'll hear from every single Muslim that you talk to. I was going to say it myself, and he just does a better job of it, so it's a 5-minute clip. We'll let him
The timeline's on the back of your paper, if you want to follow along.
What I'm going to do now is just look at the classical account. What do Muslims say concerning Muhammad? First and foremost, they say that he was born in 570. That he then got a revelation from an angel in Jibril while he was in the Hira cave, just north of Mecca. Jibril comes to him while he's meditating and says, Akra, recite. And his response was, Ma Akra, I cannot recite. He was squeezed, and then the angel repeats the same order. That happened 3 times, Finally, the angel lets him go. He goes back to Mecca, tells the story to his wife, Khadija. She then gives a test to him, and he passed that test, and then she goes and tells Waraka ibn Nawfal, her cousin, what had happened. And Waraka ibn Nawfal, then, the cousin of Khadija, who was a Christian, stipulates that truly he is a prophet. So it's one of the ironies of history that the person that actually gave the pronouncement as Muhammad is a prophet was a Christian. This is according to their account. In 610 then, those revelations started coming, and if you look at the Quran and you just basically put it in half. Now this Quran, because it's in Arabic, it starts from the right and goes to the left. So for if you just split it in half, the first part of the Quran, or what we know as Medina, the second would be Mecca, the name of the two cities where he lived. So this would be Meccan, though it's the latter half of the Quran. This would be Medina, though it's the first half. Confusing, isn't it? Just turn it upside down and you get the right sequence. But it basically says that this part, the latter part, was revealed between 610 and 622, the first 12 years. In 621, he was woken up in the middle of the night, told to get on the back of the winged horse called Burak there in Mecca, and he flies up to Jerusalem, where in Jerusalem, on the rock, where the dome of the rock is built, he then ascends the 7 heavens, meets Allah. Allah tells him to pray 50 times a day. He says, okay, he comes down 2 heavens to the 5th heaven, he meets Moses. Moses says, how many times did he tell you to pray? And he said, well, I was told to pray 50 times. He said, no, go back up and see if you can get it down. So he goes back up to the 7th heaven, gets it to 45, comes back to Moses, no, still too many. So he goes back and forth, bouncing between Allah and Moses, and brings it down from 45 to 40 to 35 to 30, down to 15, down to 10, finally to 5 prayers. Once he gets it to 5 prayers, then Moses, okay, that's enough. So it's Moses that actually stipulates how many prayers Muslims are to pray a day. Comes back down then to Jerusalem, gets back on the Burak, the winged horse, and flies back to Mecca. That's called the Miraj. That happens in 621. In 622 then, he then moves from Mecca up to Medina. That's called the Hijrah, the Exodus, with about 80, some say as many as 200 followers. And it is because of the problems he's having in Mecca.
This timeline's on your paper.
622 to 632, the last 10 years of his life, he receives the Medinan material, which is all the first part of the Quran. This material here. Now there are some Meccan references in Medina, and there's also some Medina in the Mecca, but rule of thumb, that's Meccan, that's Medina. Then from 630, he then goes into Mecca, and he takes over Mecca. He then controls all that central part of Arabia, called the Hijaz, and he dies in 632. Suddenly, some believe he was poisoned. From 632 to 634, Abu Bakr then takes over, rules for 2 years. He dies peacefully. From 634 to 644, Umar then takes over, and he is one of the ones that moves out and starts confronting and basically conquering many of the great cities of the Levant. He conquers Basra, he conquers Baghdad, he conquers Damascus, he conquers Jerusalem, and he conquers Cairo. So the 5 great cities of the Levant are now under Arab control. You notice I'm saying Arab control, not Muslim. You'll see why. That happens under the time of Umar. So by 642, the 5 great cities of Levant are now under Arab control. 644 to 656, Uthman then takes over, and Uthman, the 3rd caliph, is important because it is he that actually compiles the Quran. It is he that's given that responsibility. He realizes that there were a number of different variations on the Quran, so he tells Zayd ibn Thabit, who is the secretary of Muhammad, to then rewrite the Quran and to correct it if it needs be, if there's any difficulty, that to use the Qurayshi dialect. And he's given 3 other men to help them, Zubair, Alas, and Harith, and the 4 of them rewrite the Quran and create what we know as the canon of the Quran. That's when the Quran is finally written down, 650, 18 years after Muhammad. The Quran had not been written down when Muhammad died. It was finally written down at the time of Uthman. Very important, 650. Keep that date in your head. 650, mid-7th century. He is then killed, and then Ali comes to power and rules only for 5 years. Ali is the adopted son of Muhammad. Really, for as far as the Shiites are concerned, the really only legitimate heir to Muhammad. Now that's known, that period, from 622 or 624 up until 661. That roughly 40-year period is known as the Rashidun period. That is the rightly guided caliph period. That is the beginning of Islam. That's the golden period of Islam. That's the classical account.
So, yeah, that's basically the history of Islam that you will hear from any Muslim out there. We're not going to have time to dive into historical critiques of whether or not that actually happened, but Jay Smith has plenty of stuff on YouTube. I highly recommend watching his material because he pulls stuff from Cambridge University and big Ivy League schools of these historical professors that read and write multiple ancient languages and stuff, and he's got all the videos on it. We don't have time to cover that, unfortunately, but that's basically the classical account. So, come on, there we go. Here's just a screen cap of that timeline that he put in there in case you missed it. The dates don't 100% match up with what's on this paper because they're from different sources, but it's within a few years. It's close enough. Basically, he got the important thing is that he got his revelation in 610. Now remember, Christ died in, 33? And so this is 600 years after after Christ's death. Suddenly there's a new revelation saying, oh yeah, all that stuff is wrong. And we'll get into that more next week. So here's a map of what's called the Mirage, which is him getting on the Burak down here and going up to Jerusalem. I would like to point out that if you read the Quran or just really study Muslim history in general, they have a fairly large disdain for Christians and Jews, particularly Jews. And so it is my belief that when men were creating this religion, they specifically put one of their holy sites in Israel, in Jerusalem. That's where the Dome of the Rock is now, which is on the Temple Mount. They specifically put it there as a huge middle finger to Judaism. And so that is why there's a huge argument about who owns Jerusalem. Because the Muslims say it's theirs because it's one of their holy sites. That's where Muhammad ascended into heaven and got the 5 prayers thing and then came back down. Therefore, it's one of the holy sites. And then Jews say, we had it way before you. And then Muslims say, yeah, but your religion's wrong anyway, so you don't have any right to it. God gave it to us, is what they say. So, real quick, I want to touch on Sunni versus Shia. These are terms that you'll probably hear in the news. Basically, there are 2 sects of Islam. Think of it as Catholics versus Protestants. It's not exactly the same concept, but just think of it as 2 major sects of Islam. As Jay Smith pointed out in that video, Shiites, or Shia, they believe that Ali was the rightful successor as caliph or king after Muhammad. Whereas the Sunnis believe that it was whoever was most qualified to lead, which ended up being what happened. So there are way more Sunnis in the world than Shias. Shias are a very small minority. So 85% of all Muslims in the world are Sunnis and 15% are Shias or Shiites. Shiat Ali is what Shia stands for or means, and that means partisans of Ali. Meaning the son-in-law was to succeed Muhammad. They believe that he was the rightful caliph. Shia's religious authority is their leader. It is in their leader, called their imam, which is like their pastor. And let's see. If you notice here, right in the Middle East, right here, you'll see that Iran is heavily Shia. And there are little bitty pockets elsewhere, and that's basically it. You'll find Yemen. Nowadays, almost all of Yemen is Shia, and Saudi Arabia is all Sunni. And if you notice what's going on right now with the wars with the Houthis, that they keep lobbing missiles over here, they're different sects. These people believe that the other one has committed shirk, the other one is anathema, and the hadiths actually teach that if you apostatize from Islam, you are to be killed. It's honorable for your relative to kill you if you apostatize. And so they believe that they've apostatized, that's why they're constantly fighting each other. It goes a lot deeper than that, but that's just a high-level view. So to summarize, what does Islam claim? They claim that Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet, which is very important because they believe that all other prophets had problems, including Isa, which is their version of Jesus. We'll get to that in a second. And so Muhammad was sent to fix it. You will find a lot of parallels between this and other false religions that claim to fix Judaism or Christianity. Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, to name a couple. The Quran was his revelation sent down by Allah via the angel Gabriel. They call him Jibril, but it's Gabriel, to only Muhammad. This is a big deal because as we study what are called the Gnostic religions, the Gnostic faiths. Remember, Gnostic, like I said the very first night, comes from the Greek word gnosis, which is to know things. And so basically, in layman's term, Gnostic religions say, we know something that you don't, you need to listen to us. And what you'll find in those Gnostic religions is that their revelation is not public, it's only given to one guy, and you're not allowed to ask questions about it, you just have to take his word for it. And so the revelation was only given to Muhammad, nobody else was in the cave. He heard the revelation and he came and started telling his people about it, and then they had to believe with blind faith that what he said was given to him from God with no evidence. And so they believe that it came between 610 and 632. They believe that Islam is the final religion according to Muhammad's life and sayings and the Quran. The Quran does talk about Judaism and Christianity. It calls Christians the people of the book, the Al-Kitab, and it says that we kind of had it right, and then everything got corrupted. So they believe, and this is what we were even told by the Muslims here in town, is that Christianity was going the right way until Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea in 325, he basically wrote what we see as the New Testament, which all it takes is just a little bit of Googling to figure out that that's just baloney. We have a lot more historical evidence than that, and they don't even, I even asked some of the Muslims if they had ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had never even heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they, like he said, a lot of them will take the word of their imam, and that's it. I equate that to kind of Middle Ages or Dark Age Christian or Catholicism, where the congregation was not allowed to read the Bible. They didn't have it in their own language, and so they had to take the word of the priest. And the priest, they took a lot of liberties, and they ended up making a lot of big mistakes in the Catholic Church because nobody could vet what they were saying. That's what's happening in Islam. They believe that the imam wouldn't do you harm because in Islam, you're supposed to be a good person. You're supposed to be nice to people, to other Muslims. And so the imam wouldn't do them harm, so why would they not trust what he says? And what you get from that is that a lot of Muslims don't read the Quran. A lot of Muslims have no idea what it actually says. They just will be able to quote a couple verses, they'll be able to quote some hadiths, they'll be able to quote some ideas, and that's about it. That's not to say all of them are like that. I think there's a parallel to that in Christianity. There are a lot of people that their Bible has a layer of dust this thick on it, yet they come to church every week and they claim to be Christians, and they don't read their Bible, so they would fall flat on their face if they needed to defend their faith. The same thing happens in Islam. So Islam was given by Allah. That means, literally translated, Allah means the God. It's a very impersonal term. It was given by Allah to Muhammad to correct all the religions of the world that had strayed from the truth, including Christianity and Judaism. That's why they claim it as the final religion, because they said, well, yeah, y'all screwed it up over here, so this is finally the correction. And it came 600 years after God sent his son. And they believe all people will be brought under submission to Islam and Allah, or will face wrath and destruction, which is hell. So God is a crucial concept in Islam. God is Tawheed, which means one. There's actually a surah. So let me go back here. On the back, I defined some terms. I don't have time to go through all of them, but just kind of look back here as I say random words. That's what they mean. So surahs and ayahs, that's verses and chapters, or chapters and verses. There is a surah, I don't have it off the top of my head, but it says, say not three, but one. It's a direct jab at Christianity, saying there is no Trinity, God is not three, he's one. They emphatically believe that Christians are polytheist because they don't understand the Trinity. We even talked to the imam here in town, and he told us he's studied a lot of Christian material, although he didn't tell me what Christian material he studied, and he said he's yet to find anybody who can articulate the Trinity. They just don't want to admit that it's three gods, but it actually is. So that's what they believe. They believe that we are polytheistic and we believe in three different gods. So one of the core things, part of the Shahada at the beginning is you have to say there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. Another translation of that is there is no God but God and he is one, or there is no God but the one God. So it's very crucial. An interesting thing, when we were meeting with these Muslims, we went to their mosque, we observed their whatever, worship ceremony or whatever, and their sermon. And then we went to dinner with 3 guys that were our age. One was from Egypt, one was from Syria, and the other was from Bangladesh. I'm not going to give their names because we didn't ask them permission to do it, but whatever. So anyways, they were our age, very westernized. They grew up in those areas and then moved here and took up Western culture. We were at a restaurant that was owned by a Persian. He's lived here for 40 years, but from Persia, that's Iran. And he overheard us talking for about 3 hours about Christianity and Islam at the table. And he came up and said, well, I used to be religious like you, and then when I came to America, I realized that it's all about just compromise and live well with your neighbor. And so he had basically said that he had kind of renounced Islam, and Islam wasn't as important, which kind of got under the skin of the guys that we were with. But one of the analogies that he gave, and this is a very important one because it's very, very relevant to nowadays. I'm going to give his analogy, and then I'm going to fix his analogy for you. He said, if you have an apple, but we're speaking 3 different languages, this is called 3 different things, a different thing in every single language, but it's still the same thing. So he says, you say apple, you say apfel, and then I don't know another language. Just come up with a 3rd one. And he says, yeah, these are, but it's still an apple. That's the way it is with God. It's still God. What he was trying to say is Yahweh and Allah are the same. And he said, it's still God. You're just calling them different things and you're arguing about nothing. So I said, aha, well, what if you are trying to convey to 3 different people that have different languages and no translator present that you were talking about an apple? The best way to tell them what you're talking about is to show them an apple. When they see it, they'll recognize it and say, oh yeah, that's an apple. But if you have 2 different items that are 2 separate things, they're going to be 2 separate words. Our God is not Allah. It is a very common thing you'll find in pop Christianity, modern Christianity, woke politics, is the idea that all the Abrahamic faiths, meaning Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are all the same. We all worship the same God, we just do it in different ways. I have debated with people when I was in college about this particular thing, and the only way you can come to that conclusion is if you want to come to that conclusion because you don't want to admit that somebody is wrong. Somebody has to be wrong. The Muslims that we were meeting with even agreed with us on this. I said, look, either Allah exists and I'm damned to hell, or Yahweh exists and you're damned to hell. Although there is still repentance available and you can still get to heaven. Like, it's one of us is not right here, and I believe that I'm right, you believe you're right, so let's pit our ideas against each other. And this guy was saying, no, all the gods, all 3 of the Abrahamic gods are the same, we just worship him in different ways, but they're all going to get us to heaven in the same eventually, so why are you arguing about it? The thing is, if we look through the Quran, if you read the Quran, I encourage you to do that. We will have a document available for you. If you read the Quran, read the Hadiths, or at least some of them, they're huge. They're like 7 or 8 volumes. And then you read the Bible, put the 2 against each other, and see if they're the same. You just can't make them the same. They are just not the same. So we believe that God is Trinity, that he is one essence in 3 persons. So a good example is, so Jacob Vance is a what? He's a human being. And he is also a who? He's Jacob Vance. In the same way, God is a what? He's God. And he is 3 who's? Father, Son, and Spirit. He is not 3 separate beings, 3 separate gods. We don't believe that he's 3 separate gods. We believe that he's one God manifesting himself in 3 different who's. They believe that Allah is one, period. That is called the Tawheed. By the way, there is actually a pretty large sect of Islam that teaches that Christianity teaches that the Trinity is the Father, the Son, and the Mother. They think that Mary is part of the Trinity and not the Holy Spirit. We'll explain more on that next week. So this is the Quran. This is their scripture. Here's a copy of it. Interesting thing about the Quran is that they believe that the only valid version of the Quran is in Arabic. So any translation, if you read it in English, it's not valid, so you can't argue any points in English. Kind of convenient. So if you read something and say, oh, well, that says to beat your wife, then they say, oh, well, it's not valid because you don't know what it means because you don't speak Arabic. So we happen to have one that has Arabic next to it, so it is considered a valid translation. But these are also translated by Muslim scholars, so it seems like their problem would be with those Muslim scholars. So yeah, not translatable. They believe it is incorruptible. They believe that this text, as it is, word for word, dot for dot, letter for letter, has always existed eternally in heaven, and Allah in Arabic, and Allah sent it down. And so we have word for word exactly what resides in heaven and has always resided in heaven. They're Allah's very words themselves and no human author involved. So they call it the recitation because they believe that it was given to Muhammad and he recited it to his friends, his compatriots. They memorized it and then they recited it and wrote it down word for word. We'll get into that next week. They believe it's 100% preserved, there is nothing missing from it, and there is nothing added to it. A Muslim will not acknowledge that an English Quran is legitimate. And then the hadiths, like I said earlier, are the sayings of Muhammad written down by other people. So we don't know if he actually said it or not, but Muslims believe it, so let's at least act like that's the truth, because that's what they believe, and if we're trying to evangelize to them, then it'll be useful to just take them at their word. The next one is, who is Isa? Isa ibn Maryam. So ibn means son of. So Isa is the son of Maryam. This is who they believe Jesus is. They have an account of Jesus. So if you start talking to a Muslim, they will very quickly say, yeah, I believe in Jesus too. He was a great prophet. He wasn't God, but he was a great prophet. And then they'll go on and on about how he was the best prophet. He was the greatest prophet other than Muhammad. And he had all these divine miracles and all this kind of stuff that he did. But then you start looking at who Isa is. So let's see. Interesting thing about Mary, or Maryam, Isa's mother, is that in Surah 3, ayah 33 through 35, it says that Mary is the sister of Aaron and the sister of Moses and is the daughter of Imran. So they stole from the wrong material when they wrote this. They didn't understand that Jesus was born in 0 and that he was that Moses existed 1,1200 years prior to that. Interesting fact. And that's in the Quran. They can't dispute that. So that's a 1,200-year difference. Isa is Allah's second greatest prophet. He was born of a virgin while she leaned against a palm tree. And we'll show this in a second. We actually have the PDF scanned of the Quran that shows this. They believe that she was leaning against a palm tree next to a stream when she gave birth to him. And they believe that he preached a sermon from the cradle. That while he was still a baby, he gave his first sermon when he was only a day or so old. And that he did not die on the cross. There's actually a couple verses in here that specifically says that he did not die on the cross. His image was put on top of another person, and another person was put on top of the cross and died in his place. And that Jesus just ascended to heaven and never told anybody. And then they also believe that he will return and condemn Christians to hell for defying him, and Jews. So to compare the Quran with Jesus Christ, I like to compare Jesus with Muhammad because one of the things that Jay Smith will say very often in his talks is always go back to the book and the man. For us, we have the man, Jesus, and we have the book, the Bible. For them, they have the man, Muhammad, and they have the book, the Quran. If you pit those two against each other, it will be very obvious that one of them is better than the other. And so the Quran, like I said, because it came up in the 600s, and it was written by men, that's our thesis, is that it was written by men and it is not divine. It's very obvious that they stole material from other religions, other sects, other groups that were around, other Christian heresies as well. When Jay Smith said that it was a Christian who gave the okay for them to that Muhammad was a prophet, he was a Christian. Well, he was actually a Nestorian Christian, which is, Nestorianism is a heresy, so he wasn't actually a Christian. But anyways, yeah, so here's some references. The Quran says that it's the guidance. Jesus says, I am the way. That is not plugged in, apparently. The truth, can you come figure out how to plug that in? Make sure it's charging. The Quran says it is the truth from the Lord. Jesus says, I am the truth. The Quran, they actually believe that it will be our intercessor on Judgment Day, that the Quran will hold us in the hellfire or will allow us to come into heaven on the Judgment Day, and so on and so on. So who are we? We are called the people of the book, the Al-Kitab. The Quran nearly always refers to Christians and Jews as the Al-Kitab, or the people of the book. What the Quran says about the book is very interesting. The average Muslim is taught from the cradle that the Bible has been corrupted in the last 20 centuries and therefore is not reliable anymore. And anyone who tells you that has not read the Quran, because in multiple places in the Quran it says, if you don't understand the text, go to the Al-Kitab. Go to the people of the book and ask them, because they've had these scriptures much longer and God sent those scriptures to them. So if you have confusion about what's written in the Quran, go ask them. That's in the Quran. And yet they don't believe that. They also, this is where the idea of jinn or genies comes from. It's actually Islamic. I don't know if you knew that. It's just more of a fun fact. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but in Aladdin, the idea of jinn is Islamic. They also believe in shaitan, which is their version of Satan. He's not exactly Satan, but he kind of acts a lot like Satan. They believe that he whispers in their ears while they're praying to try to distract them and all that kind of stuff, and try to make them do evil. And this one, the afterlife, he had already mentioned the afterlife. Jannah is the Garden of Eden back in heaven. So our goal is to get to the Garden of Eden, get your houris, which are literally sex slaves for men. And then the opposite is Jahannam, which is hell. They actually believe that Jahannam for Muslims is like purgatory, that bad Muslims will go to Jahannam for a set amount of time until they burn off all their sins, and then Allah will go down and grab them and bring them back up to heaven. So it's only permanent for apostates or non-believers. So let's transition into our visit at the local mosque. We've got like 4 minutes. So so basically on Friday, I have a connection with a guy that I know, one of the guys we went to dinner with, and I was like, hey, I know you're Muslim. Do you go to the mosque over here near Shepherd Air Force Base? And he said yes, and I basically set up a time for us to go. And so there was a guy that met us there, and he showed us some of their rituals, and then he gave us some chairs in the back, and he let us sit and observe during their worship service. So he did one of the calls to prayer at like 1:45, and then they started their actual worship service, which consists of a lot of praying, a lot of rituals, and then their imam stands up and gives basically a sermon. He gives it in Arabic and then he gives it in English.
Yeah, the interesting thing, there's a lot we can say, but we're much closer to the end of the night than we expected to be. So we'll basically just say that while we were there, these are not pictures of the actual mosque, by the way. This is something I found online.
We didn't want to be disrespectful, so we didn't take pictures while we were there.
So there was a room with sinks in it and stools, and you would sit here, and to even be able to enter the building, the guy who was there asked us to cleanse ourselves, and we thought, well, it's just water. We're not
bowing down to some other deity.
We're not forsaking Christ just by getting ourselves wet. So we washed our face and our arms and our feet, and that allowed us into the building. And then I got this picture because the carpet is similar to what they had. It's like little pillars, and they sit in each of these pillars, and they prayed towards the Qibla, the wall that points to Mecca. And there's a lot more I could say about our visit there, but with the little time we have left, I just want to say that they blew away my expectations. Like, I expected there was one guy who was pretty much, that's a Muslim.
There was one guy who was a Malcolm X follower, if you know anything about Malcolm X.
Yes.
The other guys were great.
But everybody else, the imam himself and the guys we ate dinner with, if I didn't know better, I'd say they had the same charity that Christians do. Of course, I know they didn't. They were running off their own steam. We went off the Holy Spirit. But these people were very respectful. They were very pluralistic, saying, well, we're just all trying to find truth. And Brandon and I think that the sermon that the imam gave was actually prepared specifically for us, because the whole time he was saying, and remember, my Muslim brothers, we must remember not to give God a son. And you can tell the whole
and
thing.
Be a good person and do good deeds and be nice to each other and
but the whole thing about Arabic is really true, because the whole time he was saying, whenever he would quote the Quran, it was always the Arabic first, then he would translate. Arabic first, then translate. And so I just want to encourage y'all. while I'm not saying go to a mosque and attend regularly and bother these people, I'm just trying to say that if you have a Muslim that you work with, if you have a Muslim at your job, if you have a Muslim on your street, our pastor lives next to a Muslim himself. Dr. McCartney does. If you have a Muslim somewhere in your life, I encourage you, invite them over for dinner. You know, they need Christ just as much as you did, just as much as you do. And we didn't put this in the slideshow, but just consider if you invite a Muslim over for dinner, because I would encourage you to do so, just make sure that there's no alcohol or pork in the meal. Those two things are forbidden.
Preferably in the house.
In the house, yeah. If you can just take alcohol and pork out of the house, they consider it unclean. I mean, I want you to imagine if an atheist invited you over and he had pornography on the walls or something. I mean, you wouldn't like that. You'd feel uncomfortable, right? So Paul says, I become all things to all men that I might win some. What I believe that verse to mean is, while we do not cut away our Christian values, we do consider, okay, what is something I can practice just for the sake of winning this person without forsaking Christ? Well, I can give up pork for a day and have them over for dinner. You see what I'm saying? And so we hope that what you've gotten from today and what you'll get from next week is that Muslims are not trying to kill you. They are hardworking Americans just as the rest of us are. And so we were going to show you part of the Quran PDF, but we don't really have time. But we have put on our Gmail account, and I realize not everybody got that, so come up to me if you'd like to get on the Gmail account with us. We've put on the Gmail account 80 pages of the Quran for you to read at your leisure. And the verse, can you go back to the...
Photocopied from this one.
Yeah, can you go back to... Yeah. 80 pages sounds like a lot. It's this much. It's this much of the page. There's entire pages I scanned where it's just footnotes for those tryhards here. And so I would encourage you to read this. This is actually the account of Mary giving birth to Jesus right here, just for your own curiosity. Because if you're going to encounter Muslim friends or you just want to know more about Islam, read a couple verses. It'll really help you. And next slide, please. And so remember, you're going to find contradictions in their text. Any text, if you read it the right way, will sound like a contradiction. There's verses in the Bible where if you don't take a moment to consider what the author meant, oh, that's a contradiction. And so don't think that finding contradictions in the Quran is going to disprove Islam. That doesn't disprove Islam. What disproves Islam for the individual Muslim is you showing the love of Christ to them and them saying, wow, my father has never shown me as much love as you've shown me in a week. And that is actually what a Muslim convert who visited our school actually told us. He came to Christ because the man who told him about the gospel said that he loved him the first day he met him. And 20 years with his father, he'd never heard that word before. Love is not an honor-shame culture idea. That is very much a Western idea to express your love for your family members. When befriending a Muslim, again, don't assume that they believe 100% of what we just told you. They might not even know some of it. The most powerful evidence is your love for them, and the most important tool is relying on the Holy Spirit to guide you. And that's the last slide, isn't it?
Additional resource.
Yeah, so the additional resources, we got sign-up sheets over here as you're making your way out. We want you to get as much from this class as possible. As I said before when we started, there's only so much we can cover here. And if I know somebody in here has got a Muslim neighbor and they really want to be Christ to that person, consider using these resources. We have this week's slideshow available, and we have Jesus' divinity claims compared with the Quran, because they don't actually believe Jesus claimed to be God. And much more. You can read about who Muhammad is in the Hadiths. I would warn you, though, it's very graphic stuff.
Yeah.
So we've kept you long enough. I really appreciate your patience.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that they don't believe that Jesus died on the cross, but that somebody may have, in their version of Jesus, may have died on the cross.
Yes, it is very interesting.
That was interesting to me. If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So they believe that we were actually going to cover this next week, but we can cover it now. So it's very short.
Guys.
It's a very quick explanation. So the Quran, we don't have the verse right here in front of us, but there is a verse in the Quran that says, Allah is speaking, and he says, very truly I say to you that Jesus did not die on the cross. We put Judas on the cross. That's the Jacob Vance translation. Basically the idea is Judas was put on the cross to look like Jesus, and Allah didn't tell anybody about it for 600 years. And so it's pretty interesting. They'll tell you, Muslims will come up to you and say, in our religion, the guilty man died on the cross like it's supposed to happen, and in your religion, the innocent guy died on the cross. How is that just? See, Islam's obviously better. Hold on, take a minute to consider here. Allah put a man on the cross, made him look like Jesus, and didn't tell anybody. And he didn't think to tell Jesus, hey, while you're still down there, Jesus, can you tell the guys that it wasn't you? But Allah doesn't say anything about that in the Quran or the Hadith. So what actually happens is Allah is responsible for the largest Islamic heresy in the world, Christianity. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Next week we're going to get into heresies. There are a lot of Christian heresies that aren't taught in the church typically because they happened so long ago. And you can pick and pull about 8 or 9 different Christian heresies that show up in the Quran because they thought that was Christianity. And so they like the idea that somebody was put with the image of Jesus on the cross is actually a Christian heresy from the very early ages of Christianity, and they believed that that was Christianity, and so they put it on there. But we're going to cover that next week because we don't have time. We're already 4 minutes over. So
yeah, we've got 80 pages of the Quran. I encourage you to check it out.
Yeah, hopefully y'all got something from it. Come back next week because we're actually going to dive into refuting the Quran and more apologetics and polemics next week.